The first volume we produced, Ali Bey has a copy, on the collapse of Ottoman Empire in the Balkans and its social and political implications. Our second volume examines the Balkan Wars 1912-1913. The third volume I am editing together with Feroz Ahmed. It examines World War I and again the collapse of Ottoman Empire. I think the Balkans some way important role. The Balkan Muslims, because of they lived in the European continent, they were the first to feel European racism or colonial policies or Orientalism in the European discourse in the Balkans. The Balkan region, there are a number of characteristics of the Balkans. I think it is important to mention those. First, the Balkans very much a frontier zone. It is a multi-ethnic. Historically, the region used to be one of the most mixed regions in terms of ethnicity, religion, languages. Second, the Balkan region, because of geographic characteristics, because of the mountains, it provided a shelter for different ethnic and religious groups to survive. So what you have in the region, the Greeks, Albanians, and Macedonians, these are the three indigenous populations. But then the Slavs came around 7th and 8th century. The Turks came to region around 14th century. Then it became a zone of contestation between different groups. Most of the urban centers in the Balkans are built by the Ottomans. So the Ottoman presence in the Balkans, some way, I would say, the contemporary map of the region, urban centers, very much built during the Ottoman period. And the Muslim population lived predominantly in the urban centers. Christian population very much lived in the rural areas. The Ottomans came to region around, again, 14th century. Around 18th century, 1/3 of the total population of the region was Muslim. Mostly Slavic Muslims and also the converts to Islam, Albanians, Macedonians, Hungarians. Eventually they moved, Bosnians, Pomak, Turbesh, Goran. These are different Muslim groups in the Balkans. Ottoman Empire very much started to decline around mid-18th and early 19th century because of a number of reasons, but one of the critical factors in the decline of the Ottoman Empire was the technological advancement and scientific revolution in Europe, and also as a result of this technology, European empires, they start to pursue imperialist policies. The colonialism became one of the outcome of scientific revolution in Europe. After the conquest of Africa, Asia, and America, the Balkans very much became the target for new emerging empires, especially to Germany now. Italy, Germany, they also wanted to have their own share on the world map. And what we see that this imperial rivalry, especially colonialism in Europe, became a critical cause for the decline of the empire in the Balkans. So the decline of the empire started in the Balkans, the Muslim population was the first to pay the heavy price. And so it is very important to examine what happened in the Balkans to understand European policies in the Middle East, also in the Caucasus. But one thing is very important in the 19th century. That was the colonialism forced European powers to justify their oppressive policies, and this racism became a mode of justifying European policies, especially in Africa. The European empires, they justified their policies in terms of white man's burden. And Europeans, Oxford University in the 19th century, very much developed these racial categories of the white race, yellow race, and the black race. And it is quite interesting, during the 19th century, the Turks, the Muslims in the Balkans, very much labeled as Turks, even though they were not Turks, but this is the way Europeans portrayed the Muslims in the Balkans. The Turks were categorized as yellow race, not a white, but the yellow. And then the Muslims in the Balkans very much also considered not belong to white race, but the part of the yellow race. There is a big debate again during the 19th century, especially in the British universities, about the Turks. But the Turks here mean Muslims in terms of the racial categories, because in the 19th century, the Europe very much examined the social and political development in terms of the racial categories. And in addition to this racism in Europe and debate over the Turks where they fit, there was another issue at the same time, the religion. And the Europeans, they felt very uncomfortable both with the Jews and Muslims. So you had the Jewish question in Europe. In addition to Jewish question, you had the Muslim question, and the pogroms and persecutions of Jews were very common in the 19th century, in Russia, in Poland, in Hungary, including in some German towns. So Europe wanted to become pure, homogeneous, by getting rid of the other groups. The other groups very much Jews and Muslims. And this is the intellectual background of Eastern question. You might heard of the Eastern question. The European powers in the 19th century, they all talk about Eastern question and Jewish question. Eastern question means very much the Muslim question, what to do with the Muslims in the Balkans, and then you also had the Jewish question, what to do with the Jews. And what we see that the European powers, they try to solve Eastern question, that means getting rid of Muslims from the Balkans by creating states, the Serbia, Greece, later on Bulgaria, Romania. These states were created by European powers. And after creating these states created nation. In other words, in the Balkans, first you have states, creation of the state or the state making, and these states eventually, they try to create their own nation or the nation building. So there was no nation before, the nationalism, very much the nationalism, nation building carried out by these states, which were created by the European powers as a solution to Eastern question. That means the Muslim question in the Balkans. When these states were created, the first Serbia, then Greece, especially after 1877-78 war, very much the Europeans, they come to the conclusion that by creating these states, and these states will pursue nation building, and that project of nation building in the Balkans was a way of solving the Muslim question. So how do you build a nation? The Greece was first in 1821. Greece used to be 40% of the population of Greece used to be Muslim. So when Greece became independent and royal family of Greece was appointed from one of the German royal family from Germany came to Greece as the royal family of Greece now and converted to Orthodox Church, and 40% of the population of Greece used to be Muslim. So the state tried to create a Greek nation. That means to create homogeneous nation. How do you do it? You do it through three strategies. First, conversion. Second, ethnic cleansing. Third, mass killing. So nation building in the Balkans carried out by state structure, and these states, they try to build or homogenize population through conversion, ethnic cleansing, and genocides or mass killing. These were the three dominant strategies pursued and implemented in the Balkans. There's one more issue or major characteristics of the Balkan nationalism, very different than European nationalism or nationalism in the Caucasus. The role of church in the Balkan nation building in Greece or Serbia or Bulgaria, Macedonia. Here in the Balkans, the church became one of the architects of nation building. And usually the Greekness or Serbness or being Bulgarian defined by religious identity. And those who are left, the Muslims, especially the Muslims or the Jews, they were very much became the enemy as a result of this nation building in the Balkans. What we see in the case of the Balkans, again, to summarize, to simplify the argument, you have the Ottoman Empire, you have the European empires, they want to divide. Ottoman Empire also get rid of Muslim population from the Balkans. As a solution, they created these states, the Greece, Bulgaria, Romania, Serbia. Now these states, they try to homogenize population. Homogenization required war making, so the wars, violence, conflict in the Balkans became function of nation building. And the nation is defined very much by church, ethnic church. So religion became the defining glue of nationness. And both the Muslims and Jewish population, or those who did not fit into the Greek Orthodox Church or the Serbian Orthodox Church, they became the enemy. And the state tried to get rid of these enemy population through ethnic cleansing, especially through massacres. And what we see, there are three waves of ethnic cleansing in the Balkans. One wave from 1806 until 1878. This was very much rebellion at the local level, what we are seeing in the rural, it is more or less in the rural areas of the Balkans. You had a systematic effort by the certain groups to get rid of the Muslims. After 1877 until 1912, the first Balkan Wars, you have the systematic ethnic cleansing of Muslim population in the Balkans carried out by the state. So by the state structure created by major European powers. The third wave of ethnic cleansing very much from after the Second Balkan Wars, from 1913, I would say, to present, that there is a systematic effort with the support of certain European powers as well to get rid of the Muslims. And the final, hopefully it is the final genocide was the Bosnia-Herzegovina from 1991 until 1995 with the Dayton Agreement, as you all know, that the genocide in Bosnia-Herzegovina was very much legalized with the creation of Republika Srpska. Republika Srpska, an autonomous region within the Bosnia-Herzegovina, very much the creation of the genocide carried out by Serbs with the support of the European powers. There's an incredible book by the memoirs of Bill Clinton. As you know, he was president during the Bosnian War. And Clinton says in his memoirs that several times he tried to get French President François Mitterrand to support his policy to bomb Serbian positions to end the genocide in Bosnia-Herzegovina. And he says when he tried to get Mitterrand to do something, the Mitterrand and other European leaders, they said, we do not want to see another Muslim state in Europe. So what you have here, that this Eastern question, the Europe very much solved its Jewish question during the Holocaust. And the same Europe eventually tried to solve the Muslim problem, I would say, during the genocide in Bosnia-Herzegovina. And what we are seeing that racial categories which were dominant, which informed European policies in the 19th century. Now, instead of those racial categories, now you have these religious categories that the humanity, in a way, divided in terms of religious lines, informs some of the policies, not all policies, some of the policies of European powers. And then the end outcome of this racial or religious categorization becomes either ethnic cleansing or genocide, and you see this problem still not a genocide, but a different type of European policies in the Balkans today, or in the Caucasus, or in the Middle East. What we see, the legacy of colonialism, legacy of Eastern question, the legacy of these racial categorization of world population still with us, and people in different parts of the world, they pay heavy price. And I would say, let me conclude by saying that the Balkan region is what happened in the Balkans is very important to study and understand, because by understanding, by unpacking European policies in the Balkans, we can have a better understanding what is going on in the rest of the Caucasus and also Middle East as well. And I will end here so we can have more time for debate and discussion.
Thank you very much. I now invite you to ask your questions, but please keep them short and limit them to one so that we can go around and everyone has a chance to answer, okay? Thank you.
My question is, who were these imperialist powers? Were they working together or were they working at cross purposes? Because Europe has been torn by mutual dislikes all along.
Yes. By imperialist powers, there were rivalries in Europe, the France, Great Britain, Russia, Austria-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman. But these powers, some way, they had their own disagreement. But they also had a common understanding. They perceived themselves as belong to a white race versus the rest of the humanity. And they felt that they had a mission to fulfill. That was the white man's burden, or to civilize the rest of humanity on the basis of their own perceived definition of good life. So by imperialist power, we mean very much the Great Britain, France, Austria-Hungarian Empire, Russia. Certainly their policies were not the same toward the Ottomans, but they all agreed that they should get rid of Ottoman Empire or the Muslims from the Balkans.
I was curious of who had created, for instance, Bulgaria or...
Okay, the Bulgaria was...
I wanted to have something more specific.
Okay, for instance, the Greece became independent after Ottoman-Russian War in 1828-29. Serbia, Romania became independent, and Ottomans also lost the Bosnia-Herzegovina after 1877-78 war against Russia. In other words, what you have here, the major European powers intervene, especially in this case Russia, and when Ottoman Empire is defeated, these states were created. When you create these states with the royal family coming from different European countries, now they want to create Greek nation, Bulgarian nation, Romanian nation. How do you do it? Because the population is so mosaic, it is so mixed. So you have three options to create homogeneous Serbia or homogeneous Greece. One, through conversion. Second, ethnic cleansing. If you cannot kick them out, what do? You murder them. So what you have, nation building in the Balkans, very much carried out through conversion, ethnic cleansing, and genocidal mass killing. And this has been going on since 1821.
Any other questions?
In terms of building different states in the Balkans, currently right now there has a consensus in Bosnia to separate more, like Banja Luka and Bihać and a few other cities. So do you see the same thing happening over again? And do you see it leading to ethnic cleansing and conversion, or is this a different matter?
Well, I think what happened in Bosnia-Herzegovina, in Prijedor or in Banja Luka or other parts of the cities, very similar what happened in Bulgaria. And the pattern is the same. And what Milosevic called the Turks should go back to Anatolia. This was the same statement of the Karadzic. They did not see Bosniaks as Slav. And because from their own perspective, if Slav converts and becomes Muslim, they become Turk. So this is the definition of Turk in the Balkans, and this is the way the Europeans also very much defined Turk. The Turk is not an ethnic category. It's very much the way in which the Europeans defined. It was a religious category, and this is what happened in Bulgaria against the Muslim population. The Pomak, Turbash, these are Slavic Muslims. They were cleansed, ethnically cleansed, and murdered and killed, and forced out of their own indigenous territories to Anatolia, to today's Turkey. So I think what happened in Bosnia, you have the historical precedent. It is very much what we see, including in Kosovo, in terms of the ethnic cleansing of Albanian Muslims by Milosevic. You had the similar the pattern before. So there is a pattern of, but when this is happening, European powers remained in the 1990s very silent. The Europe tried to tie the hands of Bosnian Muslim population through arms embargo and allowed the Serbian military, the Yugoslav army, to carry out its own genocidal policy. So I think the European attitude or European mindset in 1990s was the same in the 19th century. Still there's otherness, still there's hate, I would say, in certain circles in Europe was dominant.
I just wanted to ask if the independence of Kosovo lately, is it the last stage of this big plan by European empires, or is it another
Which,
thing?
say it again, sorry.
The independence of Kosovo,
Yeah.
lately, is it the last stage of this big plan, or is something different?
Well, I think that certainly something the United States, I would say, somewhat doesn't share the similar historical legacy of the European powers. In other words, this colonialism somewhat more dominant in Europe. I think independence of Kosovo or independence of Bosnia-Herzegovina, even though it is we don't know whether it is a state or a nation. The Bosnia-Herzegovina, the way in which it is defined by the Dayton Agreement, it is not a functional state. It doesn't function today. And I think the Kosovo and Bosnia is very much, they somewhat managed to preserve their own presence in their own territory as a result of Muslim reaction to these policies. In other words, the Muslim countries are much more powerful today than 19th century. So I think that was somewhat, especially Clinton, the United States, because it is so much criticized in the Middle East because of the Arab-Israeli conflict. So U.S. wanted to show its different type of policy in the Balkans to show that it is on the side of the Muslims. I think that the Bosnia-Herzegovina and Kosovo today, they really, especially the independence of Kosovo, is very much the outcome of U.S. foreign policy, the Bill Clinton. So the Europeans were still not much comfortable with it, I would say. So the U.S. policy somewhat more pro Balkan Muslim, especially in Bosnia-Herzegovina and Kosovo as well. I think because of the US factor and because of Muslim countries are much more powerful economically, I think these are the two reasons why Kosovo became independent, even though many European countries didn't want that to happen.
Don't you think the United States also played this dirty role in the latest the genocide of Bosnians when Richard Brooke and the U.S. policy held all kind of any kind of support to Bosnians, while the Serbs had all sorts of military power, and with sanctions and there was embargo on, literally embargo on all sort of embargo on Bosnia, and that's the way they waited until the last minute, when a maximum killings and murders and tortures were done to the Bosnian, and I think that the late Richard Brooke, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala deal with him, he's gone, he played a very strong role of that, and it was the whole time was bought, the way we said, we were, as a political activist, we were running during those crises, running around everywhere, making the crying out for the genocide, where America played substantial role in it. And I think Clinton is, he's a hypocrite in that sense. He is not accepting the dirty role the United States played in that genocide. I don't know how much you recognize that.
Well, I think the US, especially the United States, there are different groups, the liberal, leftist sector of American population, very sensitive on human rights issue. They very much allied themselves with the persecuted, marginalized Muslim population in the Balkans. And I think, especially during the Bosnian War also, American Jewish community was very active on the side of Bosnian cause, Bosnian Muslim cause. And they mobilized because it reminded them the Holocaust, what was happening to Bosnian Muslims. This is how they imagined and portrayed in their own thinking. I think, so what you have here, because of the democratic processes in the United States, because of liberal leftist groups in the United States very much also allied themselves with the suffering of the Muslims. In Bill Clinton, for instance, he was much more assertive than George W. Bush in terms of trying to protect the rights of Muslim population in the Balkans. I think that shows that the United States, in terms of, if you compare the US to Britain or France or to Germany, much more comfortable and relaxed in terms of coping and dealing with diversity. Whereas the Europeans, they have much more difficulty to cope with other within the European continent. And I think one thing we should learn also from the Bosnian case, that the Muslim population in US or outside, to have positive impact on the political processes, they should really closely cooperate with the liberal sector of the American population, because they are more open to human rights discourse and human rights causes than some of the conservative or religious sector of American population.
Somehow I mentioned Albania or at all. And that has been for a long time basically a Muslim state. So,
Yes.
So what is going on with that in the framework of Europe? Is it because they're so mountainous, like Afghanistan, that they can't isolate themselves, or what is the situation?
Well, it is not a Muslim state, but the population, Albania is a secular state, but 65% of population nominally, or it is the Muslim population. And Albania, again, went through a difficulty of Enver Hoxha, certainly. I think having Albania independent state being next to Kosovo, and it really played an important role during the war in terms of restoring the independence or supporting sovereignty of Albanian population in Kosovo. But in addition to, I think the Turkey, Albania, Bosnia, these are majority Muslim countries, but they are, in terms of the state, they are very much secular oriented states, Albania, Bosnia, Turkey as well. It's a constitutionally secular state. Even Turkish Prime Minister, when he was in Egypt, last time he told Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood that they should insist on a secular constitution. Certainly that angered some groups in the country. Yes.
Thank you.
Actually, my comment is not just a question. Listening to your statistics, Greece had 40% Muslims in the 19th century and middle 1840s, 50s. Then the Greeks, the church were able to convert them in Bosnia and all that. This kept on my mind a failure, double failure of the Muslims, especially the Ottoman Empire, when they stayed almost 400 years in the Middle East and in Bosnia. They were not able to establish very powerful Muslim, local Muslim population. They ruled the Middle East, they ruled by their own forces, coming Turkish troops, garrisons, and they left the population, especially in the Balkans, as we see that, defenseless. They don't have militias to be able to defend itself. When they retreated, all the Muslims were in that era, they were defenseless, as we see what happened in the recent war in Bosnia and Serbia. And the Muslim world actually failed the Bosnians and the Kosovo miserably, officially speaking. Muslim governments did not interfere at all, except the Muslim volunteers, which mainly Arabs came to, was to help. So there's military and, I don't know, political, whatever, religious failure of all these systems to leave the Muslims defenseless, and they were prey to this kind of conversion by the church, whatever it is. And we see the results of that. And I see from 19th century, Abghani, Abdo, Rashid, and all actually they failed miserably to establish an Islamic thought which deal with this kind of problems, local and international.
No, I think you are right. The Ottoman Empire, one of the reason why empire collapsed had to do with the lack of critical thinking. In other words, when empire became oppressive, it stopped investing in education and supporting critical thinking. Empire could not, Ottoman Muslim societies could not compete with European scientific research and knowledge. I think this is something very important. The decline of Muslim states had to do with, at the individual level, I will say, Certainly there is also institutional framework of this critical thinking, the gap or deficit of knowledge, and not investing enough in education. The Ottoman Empire became very corrupt in the 19th century also, and the empire couldn't know how to respond to European based scientific revolution, and it tried to. So what you have in the 19th century, you had three responses to development in Europe. One was a conservative religious response that we are losing the wars because we are not good Muslim, so they insisted on trying to pursue. Huh?
We're still saying that.
Yes, still there are some. And then the second group emerged. They said, well, let's accommodate, let's change our mentality, our thinking, and try to adapt the technological transformation in Europe, but at the same time upgrade our own understanding of Islam. The third solution was the Kemalist solution, or Habib Bourguiba pursued the same solution, that was get rid of Islam and just westernize at the expense, or in a way you become modern without Islam. So they perceive that the path to modernity goes through secularism, that means getting rid of Islam. So these were the three major positions, what to do in the 19th century. And I think the late Ottoman Empire, very much these three groups had a major competition, tension, conflict. Eventually, the Kemalist won the intellectual debate, and the Republic of Turkey very much emerged to create a secular European nation state, and it defined modernity without Islam, that the Kemalism means becoming modern without Islam. But today, in 2013, you have a different government in Turkey. They say, we want to be modern with Islam, not without Islam. So I think the things changed. In other words, I think this is another fourth way what to do, what needs to be done. But to answer your question, I think one of the fundamental problems today still in the Muslim world, really the lack of critical thinking. That this is or not enough room for individualism. And Muslim societies are too communitarian. They are somewhat oppressed between the sheikh on one hand, the religious ulama or the scholars, or their tribal primordial ties. There's a wonderful article in The Economist, the last issue, a summary of a book, a scholar in Harvard University, and they argue that one of the factors of religious fundamentalism in different Muslim countries had to do with lack of investment in religious education. I think this is another issue that most of the governments ignore to invest properly in religious education.
We still have time for a couple more questions.
The reasons that stimulate the genocide somewhere, the corruption or the corrupt empires or the corrupt rulers among the Muslims, among the nations, and that played a big role. And even today, if I look at it, the corruption has been the biggest issue among the Muslim nations. And then secondly, the dictatorial rule, because these are the dictators who even define and in the past, many parts of even Islamic curriculum. If you look at Islamic curriculum, it's staggering. Where a time has come where there are ijtihad has been, stopped. The consensus of the people, ijma, that has been gone, and that benefited the dictatorial rule of prince and queens and kings.
Well, I think, first of all, I think the Muslims historically, they expected solution at the state level. I think that was a big mistake. The Ottomans especially, that it was very much a state-centric culture. They tried to solve the problem at the state level. But I think today the situation is much different. Today, certainly there are problems in different Muslim societies. But today I think there is lots of dynamism. At the same time, I think the modernity, this whole globalization, provides new opportunity spaces for different groups or different Muslim communities and intellectuals to think and challenge some of the old answers. And I think there is an intellectual debate that is much more dynamic today. Certainly it is not the same everywhere. Sometimes people look at one country, they say, look at the Muslim world. No, there's no one Muslim world. There are, I am actually finishing a new book. It is called 8 Zones of Islam. And I argue that there are 8 different types of Islam. One is the Arab zone, Persian zone, Turkish Ottoman zone, Turkic Central Asian zone, South Asian, Pakistani, Indian zone, Malay Indonesian zone, African zone, and diaspora zone. So in each zone, you have different historical factors and actors, and then each zone, you have different conceptualization or contextualization of Islam. And what we are seeing is diversification of understanding of Islam in the world. I think the situation today is much, much better, but still it is not enough. I think that more work needs to be done. And but there are some good scholars out there. I think the book that I just came out last month, my book on the Islamic Enlightenment, that there are some copies available there. I try to examine, at least in the case of Turkey, when and under what condition Islam empowers critical thinking and it helps to promote open and civil society. Because usually people see Islam somewhat an obstacle, but in the case of Turkey, I would say last 3 decades, the situation is much different. You have different types of imagined Islam than what it used to be out there.
Can I say one comment? Very quick. I'm sorry. Oh, there was enough 5 minutes anyway. I'm looking at the quotes. What is it, these 8 zones of Islam, Turkish, Persian, whatever? Don't you see that they still are ruled in Turkey, subcontinent, sub-Asia, by Abu Hanifa and Ibn Hanbal and all that? They could not get out of this kind of
Mess.
we're still running our personal, social, even economic life according to these four madhahib, which really we still under their, not even impact, their power.
Mashabs. Four mashabs,
yeah,
okay.
madhab, you know, the Ottomans and Turkish and some of the Hanafis in Saudi Arabia, Hanbalis and Shafis and name it, in North Africa, Malikis. We still did not get out of the grip of those four great imams. They're still ruling us. They're still the eight. I think my humble opinion should take in consideration, look into these madhab, how much impact those areas, regardless of their ethnic, linguistic, whatever political background.
Well, I don't see mashabs as an obstacle for critical thinking. I think it depends how you see these mashabs. I see the mashabs guides. First of all, these mashabs reflect the geographic economic conditions of each region. That the Hanafi, Shafi'i, Maliki, Hanbali. But these mashabs, we should see them as a way of guiding rather than dictating what needs to be done. And they are, I think, for different debate and discussion. We don't need to, for different interpretation of Islam on the basis of economic and geographic condition. But it's up to us today. We should not really say, oh, I am a Hanafi, I always have to go by Hanafi. No, I think today's conditions and, sometimes if it fits your condition, you can follow the Shafi'i or the Hanbali, or it's like going to supermarket and picking and choosing. But you have to examine with your own decision. You need to use your own mind. Which one? But I don't see these mashabs as obstacle to critical thinking. I think the major obstacle to critical thinking is some of the ulama in the Muslim world, because in Pakistan, in India, some other places, there is not enough investment in religious education. And
madrasas, they're filling all over. The madrasas there. I mean, really, I was in Pakistan last year, and madrasas are all over. This is pure religious education. I understand with you. Egypt, look at the Azhar and all these branches all over Egypt. Not the government, official government to Mubarak and what his name is, Sabari, but the local, the people, madrasas all over the Muslim world. There is no Islamic education. It's there. It's spread all over. I visit those madrasas.
Yeah.
And I go to those people. I was in Pakistan. I visited our world. We have them all over.
Thanks God we don't have too many madrasas in Turkey. But you have the government investment in the same way in Indonesia, Malaysia. I think there is, finally, let me conclude by saying this. If you look at these 8 zones, in my book, hopefully it will be done next year, I try to argue that the future of Islam belongs to frontier zones, Malaysia, Indonesia, Tatarstan, Turkey. I think these are more dynamic societies. You have more established rule of law and democracy. The past of Islam belongs to the Arab world, the past. Because of the political economic conditions. But I think it is very important to look at what goes on in Malaysia, the largest Muslim population in Indonesia. I think it's an incredible intellectual debates are going on there, much more interesting than in some other parts of the world. And including in Bosnia and Herzegovina, look, Mustafa Seric, for instance, the former Reisul Ulama, he was a student of Fazlur Rahman from University of Chicago. and he wrote one of the best book on the Maturidi, the Maturidi interpretation of Islam, published in Kuala Lumpur. There are, I think, more intellectual activities I find much more interesting in what goes on in the periphery of the so-called Muslim world than in the Arab world. But the Arab world is only 1/3 of the Muslim population. Let's take last question and then, yes, go ahead.
I just feel that you should have not omitted here, the Western world, where there are more and more Muslims, and I think there is much going on that is new. And I think there can be a lot of hope for Islam by the new thoughts that come into the Muslim world.
In the West?
Yes.
No, I think, for instance, look at the writings of Tariq Ramadan. Yes, I think, or Abdul Al-Naim from Sudan, but he teaches in Emory University now, or Fazlur Rahman, he used to teach at the University of Chicago. So I think, there are some major intellectual debates and discussions are going on. We should not only focus on one country and one region and look at the Muslim population globally. There are some good intellectual debates are taking place.
Just on your discourse, just wanted a quick comment. But there is a big gap.
Between?
There is a big gap taking place between the intellectual, the people who will subscribe or follow Fazlur Rahman or maybe Tariq Ramadan, and the people on the street.
I agree.
The masses, big masses, they are still clinging to those, with all due respect to the mullahs and muftis, who have, forbid the ijma of the ummah, who have forbid the ijtihad, still clinging to the interpretation of the fiqh, which may not even apply today, or may not be, the circumstances may not be. So I see a big gap.
No, I think you are right. There are big gaps, let's say, in Pakistan. There are big gap in the Arab world. But there's less gap in Bosnia. Let's say Mustafa Saric, Ali Izzat Begovic, their thinking and then the views of the masses. Or there's less gap in Turkey, I would say, because of the Gulen movement, because of other things. But when you have it depends on the education, but you are right that there are, in some places there is gap, in some places you have less gap, but in some really there are major issues, in some other, Well, the book again, this Islamic Enlightenment, I try to show there how to close that gap, what needs to be done to bring the large masses together with the progressive ideas and actions. Well, thanks again. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.